Let's bring in Hollywood divorce attorney David Glass for more on this. David?
People going through divorces are going through some of the hardest times of their lives, and a lot of what they're going through is emotional. And in any divorce, there's a huge sense of loss, and loss of relationship, of money, some friends.
David Glass here for another episode of the Hourglass Podcast, where family law and psychology intersect. I'm a certified family law specialist, former psychologist, and the author of Moving On, Redesigning Your Emotional, Financial, and Social Life After Divorce. We focus on lots of topics related to divorce and breakups to help people get through the process. Today's focus is on domestic violence and romantic relationships, a pervasive problem in this country. Some recent statistics state that more than 12 million men and women experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner every year. That means that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men are victims of an attack by an intimate partner at some point in their lifetime. Add to that, almost half of all men and women in the U.S. have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner in their lifetime. As you can see, there's a need for lots of preventative measures and protection. As a side note, we covered psychological abuse in 2 of our most recent episodes. We talked extensively about gaslighting and narcissism. Overall, whether it's mental or physical abuse, the statistics are staggering. With physical abuse, the problem is that many people don't know what to do when it happens to them. Who to call, how to protect themselves, how to prevent it from happening again, what their rights are. We're going to break down some of that for you. Let's get started. Today, we have Southern California criminal defense attorney Alaleh Kamran, who has been in practice for 31 years. She defends clients in both state and federal courts. She handles cases on the federal level in California, Arizona, Michigan, New York, Texas, and Washington, and practices in all the courts of California. While she handles all sorts of criminal offenses, she's going to talk to us today about domestic abuse. What acts are categorized as assault, what the legal implications are if you've committed them, and what you should do legally once you've been arrested. First of all, Alaleh, welcome. Can you tell us about your background and experience in domestic violence?
Thank you for having me, first of all.
Sure.
It's a pleasure being here. So I got my start about 32 years ago at the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office on the prosecutorial side. And after I passed the bar, there was not an opportunity to stay with the DA's office. They weren't hiring. So I ended up going in the criminal defense field, working by myself for myself. And one of the very first few cases that I got were murders resulting from domestic violence. So I jumped in both feet in the deep end of the pool. And I've been doing domestic violence defense for the last 31 years. Mainly, the focus of my cases have been women who've been abused and they're arrested when they strike back.
Interesting. So, can you give us the definition of domestic violence?
Look, any act of violence against a domestic partner or somebody with whom you have a dating relationship with or have had a dating relationship with in the past will be categorized as a crime of domestic violence if the district attorney or the city attorney decides to prosecute.
Okay, so is this only physical violence and threats of physical harm?
No. So in the world of domestic violence, domestic abuse, anything from criminal threats, I'm gonna kill you, I'm gonna break your kneecaps, to false imprisonment, to vandalism, taking somebody's phone and throwing it against the wall, putting somebody in the closet and locking the closet on them, pushing, shoving, hurting them physically or their belongings, or doing anything that's harmful, threatening, or assaultive will be considered domestic violence. Even if the charges are negotiated and reduced, and we can get to that in a little bit later, but even if the charges are negotiated and reduced, because they emanated from a dating relationship, even if there was one dating incident, okay, the specific conditions of probation will be different than regular conditions that are imposed on non-domestic violence, batteries, or false imprisonment.
So there's a whole list of specific remedies or punishments associated with domestic violence.
Correct. So, for example, let's say there's a fight between X and Y, and we don't even need to decide gender here, and because of whatever reason, there's negotiations between the prosecutor and the defense attorney, and then the charges are reduced from domestic violence charges to regular battery, 242 under California Penal Code. So even if it's reduced to a regular 242, let's say for immigration purposes, you're still going to get the domestic violence conditions of probation, which is anger management classes, which is you will be have to do the restraining orders, the protective orders. There will be a fine and fee. So all these things will become condition of probation. The court cannot dismiss those. The prosecutor has no discretion to get rid of those. It was reduced down.
Now, in family law, we have domestic violence restraining orders, which is a whole different area than criminal defense cases based on domestic violence. But lately, the big issue, the hot topic, has been something called coercive control. Is that a term that's used in criminal defense circles?
It is easier to use in family law cases.
Right.
In criminal cases, because you have that high burden of proof, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, coercive control has to be one of the elements that the prosecutor has to prove. We do not have that as an element of any specific crime, but it becomes part of the evidence, the motive that the government can produce, can show, to show the modus operandi of the defendant. But you talked about a restraining order, and all my alarms went off, and the restraining order becomes the first step, usually. Right. If the complaining witness obtains a restraining order, and that restraining order is later violated by the suspect/defendant, then that can become in and of itself the basis for an additional criminal charge.
Right.
And that can itself, while a violation of a restraining order in and of itself cannot be a criminal charge, once it is granted and once it is registered with the police department, a violation can become the basis of a criminal case.
Right. And in terms of the timeline, can you explain to our audience that an act of domestic violence happens? And if the police are called out, what are the steps or hurdles that a case has to go through before it even gets to the prosecutor, before it even gets to potentially going to court?
So let's say there's a call to the police department, and the police come out to the scene. They will interview the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator, or who they think is the perpetrator, and they will interview both sides. Usually what happens is that they end up arresting somebody. Mm-hmm. Whether that's correct or not, I can't argue with that. But we know that in domestic violence cases, usually somebody is arrested. The evidence, there's an evidence gathering process that takes place. And then the detective does his investigation afterwards, whether it is to take a follow-up statement from the complaining witness or from the suspect/defendant. And then they will present that to the prosecutor's office, whether it's the city attorney's office or the district attorney's office, again, depending on the severity of the crimes and the offenses and the injuries. And then the prosecutor at that time will decide whether or not to file cases. Mm-hmm. After the O.J. Simpson, Nicole Simpson case years and years ago, the law was changed. And now complaining witnesses cannot take back their complaints. Once a complaint is initiated, once a call is made out and the police department comes out, more often than not, a case will be filed. The argument being, we're not going to be responsible if somebody ends up dead. Let a jury decide whether somebody is guilty or not. Some prosecutorial offices will allow the cases to go by way of a city attorney hearing if there is no prior cases, or if the evidence is not strong enough, or the allegations are not severe enough to warrant a filing of a criminal case. So there will be a city attorney hearing or a district attorney hearing, and which will allow the prosecutor's office to talk to each party separately, basically tell them that we're going to keep the file for a while. If nothing happens, we won't file it. If something happens, we will reactivate the file. But once a complaint is filed, or the police come out and somebody is arrested, then that person either stays in custody until they go to court for the arraignment, or they will post bail, they will come out, and then they will go back to court. But more often than not, there is a protective order that is issued separating the couple so that the offending or the allegedly offending person cannot go back to the residence for a cool-off period until such time as the court can reassess and review the facts to decide whether or not the person can go back to the family residence.
Right. And then so what would it take for a case to get to the district attorney, not to end up with the city attorney's office, and for it to actually go to a trial?
Okay, so usually the city attorney, at least in Los Angeles County, the city attorney's office handles misdemeanors. And misdemeanors are any of the crimes, and they can be misdemeanors or felony, like vandalism, assault, battery. All of these crimes are crimes that can be misdemeanors or felonies, depending on the severity of the injuries or the damage. The city attorney's office files misdemeanors. The punishment is less than 1 year in county jail. And the district attorney's office files felonies. The punishment is more than 1 year in county jail. Generally speaking, I don't want to get into a whole discussion of it. But usually, in order to get to the DA's office, you need to have cuts and basically stitches, broken bones. You need some serious injuries, not necessarily severe. At the misdemeanor level, it's more like bruising type injuries to pushing, shoving, and damages, vandalism damages of less than $950.
Great. And so what are some of the minimum sentences associated with being convicted of one of these felony charges?
Okay, so at the minimum, let's talk about both misdemeanors and felonies, and then also collateral consequences. At the minimum, once there is a misdemeanor conviction, there is somewhere between 26 to 52 anger management classes that are done every weekly basis. So you have to go back to court. Probation is for at least 3 years. There is about a fine and penalty of $400 plus penalty assessment, which is a lot more than that. And then there are conditions. No force and violence, no gun conditions. You lose your right to bear arms. You have to turn in your guns. You're not going to be able to have any guns for the next 10 years. There's all these federal consequences too. On the felony side of it, there will be jail time. There might be prison time. If there's prison time, then you lose the right to vote. You lose your civic rights. And whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony and you're not a naturalized citizen, it will be considered an aggravated felony for immigration purposes. Wow. It can end up in loss of green card or your ability to stay in the country. You know as well as I do that on the family law side of it, it can result in the loss of custody or not necessarily legal custody, but physical custody. In juvenile cases, there's collateral consequences in every aspect of the law. Also, if you're a professional like a doctor, lawyer, pharmacist, a nurse, as soon as you're arrested, the fingerprints are sent to the Department of Justice, which will then alert the licensing agency. Wow. And the licensing agency will send the doctor, the nurse, the pharmacist, say, "Hey, buddy, you were arrested. Come tell us why. And now, not only do you have to fight the case in the criminal court, you now have to defend the case in such a way that when you go in front of the board, you do not lose your license. I mean, there will be consequences, but you need to do it such a way so you don't lose your professional license.
Right. Does the three strikes law apply to domestic violence?
Any act, any crime that is serious or violent, choking, hitting where you have broken bones, any assault that results in great bodily injury, assaults with knives, with guns, any felony criminal threats that are threatening to kill somebody. Those are the Penal Code 422. Those are strikes. They're all strikes. If they're filed as a felony, they can also be filed, if there's serious or violent injuries, can be filed as strikes. Now, as a first strike, if you end up going to prison or county jail, you do about 80 to 85% time. You don't get the 50% time off. But if it's a second offense, and you have a prior strike, then the sentence can be doubled.
Right. So serious consequences in the law for any kind of domestic violence.
Serious, very serious. It's not to be taken lightly at all.
Right. And now there have been a host of celebrity domestic violence cases over the last several years. With those cases, do they go through any sort of different process, or are they prosecuted in the same way that, I hate to use the word term, but everyday domestic violence is prosecuted?
So celebrities in the courthouses, the cases are touched and dealt with in a different way. It doesn't matter whether it's domestic violence or whether it's DUIs or anything else.
Right.
The problem is not that they're celebrities. The problem is that if the cases go to trial, it's really difficult getting a properly unbiased jury, and it becomes a media circus. So usually, depending, I'm sure we're talking about Mel Gibson, Charlie Sheen, there's Chris Brown, there's all these cases. Yeah. So because there are different ways of dealing with cases and with probation and supervised supervision, people can go to rehab, people can do classes, people can be in counseling. If the means can be achieved through non-custodial sentences, that is the preferred method. That is the preferred method in any case anyway. Sure. But where there is celebrity status and there is money, there is also a willingness on behalf of the courts and the prosecutor's office to try to see if they can work it out without sending the person to jail.
That makes sense. All right, what have we missed at all, if anything, about domestic violence that you could inform our audience about?
I think the one thing that I want to point out is that in all the years that I've done criminal defense, when I come across a domestic violence case, I'm really, really interested in finding out about what happened in the life of my client. Mm-hmm. What is it that my client went through? And if I understand what my client endured and what he or she went through and what he or she needs, then my job becomes to put my client in a position where this doesn't happen again.
Sure. Now, Alaleh, do you run into situations where someone who was the victim of domestic abuse or domestic violence at some point fights back or gives something back in terms of being abusive? And how are they handled differently than the average criminal defendant?
So in California, we have the battered wife syndrome. And so you've taken abuse for years and years and years, and you finally strike back, you hit back, or you kill, or you're arrested. It didn't used to be a defense, it is a defense now. But not all cases rise to that level. Right. You have situations where you have the abused partner who strikes back, and the abuser is smart enough to call the cops first. And so the cops show up, but you have the abuser who doesn't get arrested and is the abused partner who struck back, who gets arrested and then comes to the office and says, but, I really don't want to go to court. I don't want to lose my relationship because they're in a weaker position, either financially or for whatever reason. And the question becomes, what do we do? How do we defend this case? What do I do to best serve the interest of my client? And while every case is different, and while we have to examine what we want in every case, the one thing that is most important is that whether you love the person or you don't, if the person is abusing you, there is no place for you in that relationship anymore, because that is not love. You are not being loved. Right. And you need to understand, and that is what I try to do with my clients, and I need to make them understand that your act of forgiving them may be an act of love, but their act of abusing you is not an act of love. And so you're not loved. And if you're not loved, you need to find a way to get out. So let me give you resources. Let me help you. Let me connect you with therapists. Let me connect you with resources within the community that are going to help you extricate you from this relationship that is so volatile that might end up in your death, as opposed to sometimes, moving out of the house is like the best thing that can happen to you. It's like, we're not going to fight the protective order. Move out of the house, get your stuff together, and let me help you get out of this relationship. Sometimes this is the best thing that could have happened to you.
Excellent advice. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I close out each show with a set of song lyrics because most people who are suffering find solace in music. Many find it comforting to know a songwriter has shared their misery and that they're not alone. And most enjoy songs that are uplifting and have a promise of hope. Such is the case with Stronger by Kelly Clarkson. The overall message seems to suggest that a person was in a long-term relationship and finally had the courage to leave it. It goes on to affirm that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That is the case with many men and women who find themselves in an abusive cycle. Those who have the courage to finally leave the relationship where there seemed to be a long-running pattern of abuse. The lyrics are emphatic, yet also hopeful. Some of my clients tell me it's a great song to sing when they're feeling angry. Try it. It's a suitable reminder that you have the power to move on.